Good evening, my friends. Come on in and have a seat. Grab a drink and a bite to eat. Settle in now, for I have quite the story for you tonight. Are you ready? Good. Then let us begin. In the last video, I changed things up a bit by adding in a ritual creepypasta that I wrote. Now, let us return to more true stories with your favorite Appalachian narrator, Phantasmal Poppy. My previous true account was a story from my abnormally paranormal granny. As I stated before, in the butter churn for those of you who missed that video, my grandmother did not have an unusually supernatural start to life. Instead of having weird stuff happening to her when she was a kid, like me, hers mostly started in her late teens. However, she did grow up hearing the spooky stories of her relatives. So, like many of her family and neighbors, she was accustomed to strange things being a part of the natural order. Still, there is one account that stuck with her over many, many years. I will warn you that tonight's story deals with something very serious. It's not tinged with the normal kookiness of my other true stories. And while it isn't graphic, I'm not breaking my own uploading rules over that one. This is definitely one you wouldn't want to play at a youth camp or in front of young children. Or maybe you would. After all, as disturbing as it is, it really did happen, and despite its potentially triggering nature, the lessons to be learned from it are still very real. This is one of those stories that I hope helps more than entertains. This is a tale of fortunes, of family secrets kept well hidden, and of vindication come many years too late. This is the tale of the Tea Reader. This story takes place about 7 years before my grandmother was born, and was initially relayed to her through her father, though parts of it have been retrieved over the years through other relatives and friends of the protagonist of tonight's story. That young man we'll call John. And John had anything but an easy life. His father was, in my opinion, nothing short of a monster. John's father was a wicked man, with a cruelly sharp tongue and a penchant for being liberal with both belt and his hand whenever he wanted to punish the boy. He could also be very charming to his neighbors, so some did not see through the facade that his son was merely a sullen boy who liked to pick fights. Unfortunately, there were plenty who knew the truth about John's father, had seen the blitzkrieg of unbridled fury, and heard the deluge of disturbing lies that fell from his lips the moment he knew that whomever he had his sights set on either no longer cared or was no longer of any use to him. And poor John and his half-sisters, from his mother's side, took the brunt of his abuse. One of the sadder parts about John's story is that, back then, Child Protective Services wasn't exactly a thing. Even if they had been, mountain families didn't typically cross certain lines. Interfering with how parents raised a child was a thing just not done, save by either a sharp-eyed pastor or a handful of close family members, usually aunties or grandparents. And even then, they had to have a certain caliber of character to even get involved in that. Sometimes, parenting issues could be smoothed over easily, either by them taking the word of someone close to heart, having help from other relatives, or even the child being adopted by another family member while the parents went off to do whatever they wanted. Be with a lover, leave the state, join the circus, whatever. But all the money, cajoling, and threats in the world wouldn't have done a bit of blasted good to that narcissistic piece of spongy, rotten potato that was John's father. If it was anything like what I've seen out of families from that region during my time there, I imagine interference from others probably did worse for John than good. In the end, a mostly blind eye was turned on John and his father, and probably more than a few prayers were whispered by their few relatives that John would quickly escape the moment he turned old enough. That moment came far too soon, but not in any way anyone could have ever foreseen. Before that, though, John spent his days working hard and his thoughts drifting listlessly between what amusements the region provided. So, when a couple of his friends came to him with stories about a fortune teller in the area, John's curiosity got the better of him. At the time, there was a family that lived on a little homestead down by the river. There, in a quaint little house nestled among swaying willows and stoic oaks, lived a lady with an unusual gift: the ability to tell fortunes through tea leaves. Here I must bring up a bit more history of the region. While many folks allied themselves with fundamental denominations of Christianity, and were blatant decriers of anything that was supposedly witchcraft, there were certain things that some folks considered to be a gray area. In certain cases, usually in families that had African, Native American, or Irish ancestors, there were certain beliefs and skills that the more supernaturally inclined folks made use of, and there were plenty who gravitated toward those individuals. Depending on how helpful you were, you could be labeled as either having a divine gift or being a satanic witch. Having a gift of healing through natural medicine would be looked upon much better than, say, being able to see what your neighbors were doing by looking through a sieve. As for fortune-telling, tea leaf reading was a fairly popular form of divination in the Appalachians. If you want a glimpse of it, there's a later episode of The Waltons that actually has a segment with a character having her tea leaves read. It was most often used as a party game for young women, as Ouija boards, despite their prolific history, really were not a thing in that area until about the 1960s or 70s. Some people, however, had a real knack for finding precognitive messages in tea leaves. It was whispered that the woman that John went to was never wrong. Early one morning, John left his home and met his friends atop the hill overlooking the homestead. Together, they walked down to the farmhouse and knocked on the door. A farmer answered the door and greeted the boys warmly, and wasn't a bit deterred to see a bunch of eager-looking teenagers on his front porch. "You're here to see Dolly, aren't you, fellas?" the man asked. They all nodded, to which the man chuckled. "Figures. Kids always come here, wanting to see what the wife's gonna tell them." At that, he called into the house to tell his wife that she had company and that she might want to put on some tea. After that, he clapped one of them on the shoulder and left for the fields. Inside, John and his friends found the lady of the house already preparing them a place to sit. Outwardly, she appeared to be a typical mountain matron from the time. A woman of middling height in her 40s or early 50s, slender yet with some of the creeping softness around the middle and face, garbed in a long homemade dress, with her thick graying hair piled high atop her head, with a bun nestled amidst the fluffy pompadour like a cherry atop a cupcake. Dolly, as we'll call her, greeted them with grandmotherly warmth and bade them all sit down. Presently, a cup was placed before each boy, into which Dolly placed a modest helping of dried leaves. Of course, as this was the Appalachians in the 1930s, this sort of tea was not your usual cup of rooibos. No, these were herbs the woman had grown herself, with a few scavenged here and there from the surrounding woodland. Since the only doctors in that area were the ones that traveled up into the mountains every few months, the lady likely pulled from a stash that was used to treat common ailments at home. Once the kettle had begun to whistle, Dolly whisked the pot off the stove and poured a bit into each of the youth's cups, and then settled herself at the table. While the tea was cooling, she chatted a bit with the small group, putting most of them at ease with her sweet and kindly manner. All except for John, that is, who mostly spoke in short replies and nods. Dolly seemed to understand, though, and she did not pry. Even though John felt very isolated from most people due to his traumatic raising, Dolly was one of the many who saw past his father's charming facade. It was one of the reasons that she, like several others, would not attend the church where John's father was pastor. For, at her age, one knows it is difficult to be truly ministered to by a veritable snake in the grass. Once the small talk was over and the tea had cooled somewhat, she explained the process of how she would go about divining their future. Then, she bade each boy drink his cup down to the dregs, leaving behind only the least bit of water and most of the leaves. Each cup would then have a saucer placed upon it, and then both would be overturned. One by one, the cups were then handed off to her, where she would turn each upside-down cup clockwise upon the saucer. Once, twice, thrice. Upon the third rotation, she would remove the cup, set it aside, and then turn her attention to the patterns that rested upon the saucer. Each boy was then told his fortune. To one, a happy conclusion to some business venture he wanted to bring to the family farm. To another, a warning that his rabble-rousing behavior would soon get him into more than mischief. To the third, the promise of a very fruitful conclusion to his offering courtship to a particular young lady. Finally, John slid his cup across the table. Dolly turned it. Once, twice, thrice. Then she picked up the cup. When John first heard about the fortune-teller, he did not quite believe his friends, waving off the idea and nearly abandoning it. The more they talked about it, though, the more it intrigued him. When he finally agreed to give it a go, he played it off as going along more for the others' sakes than his own, mostly to prove he wasn't chicken. But considering the reaction his friends saw after he left that house, I have a feeling that John held the outcome of that visit in a lot more importance than he let on. After all, if she really could read the future, then maybe she could see some end to his horrible home life. Maybe he hoped that the money he was squirreling away from his father by secretly doing odd jobs would soon be enough to buy his own farm. Perhaps he figured he would be brave enough to leave the mountains behind entirely, heading up north to go work in a factory like some of his half-brothers had. Maybe he hoped that God would just strike his hellish father dead and free his whole family from the pain the man caused on a daily basis. Instead, John got none of that. He watched as the beaming face of the mountain woman across from him turned dark, going from smiling to confused as she turned the saucer around this way and that. He watched her freeze, unable to do nothing but blink down at what she was seeing, the color draining from her face. John asked her what was wrong. Dolly shot a strained smile his way, not quite looking at him, speaking quickly about it just being silly. It's only a game, and you boys should be heading back home now, right? She hastily began gathering up the dishware, avoiding the bewildered looks and protestations of the boys as she headed over to the sink. John, however, was not about to leave without hearing what Dolly had seen. He cornered her by the sink, refusing to be shooed away until she told him. Dolly tried to change the subject, saying that they needed to go, that she needed to go help her husband up in the fields, that she had the house to attend to. About anything and everything anybody could possibly say in one breath, she said, in an attempt to get John out of her house. But he wouldn't be deterred. Instead, he took her by the arm and turned her around to see fear. There was no mistaking it. The same wild-eyed look, with pupils wide enough that they ate the colors from your eyes, of hitched breath, of strained orbs that became moister and moister with each blink. It was a look that John soon shared. He asked her one more time, what did she see? "I'm sorry, John," she told him, "but I don't see a future for you." At first, his friends tried to wave the whole thing off too, the way Dolly had. Sure, she may have gotten a few fortunes right, but even a broken clock is right 2 times a day. After all, exactly how good is a future, or lack thereof, when all you have to go on is little more than a steaming cup of hay water? Unfortunately, there was a lot more going on in John's household than I have let on. More than even he knew before that night. After John left the tea reader's house, he wasn't in the mood for company anymore, so he headed back to his family's house. I don't think anything could have prepared him for what he was about to find waiting for him. His 14-year-old half-sister was pregnant. His unmarried half-sister, who had never expressed an interest in anyone in her life, who, if she had, would have been lashed to no end with a belt because of her strict father, was pregnant. Considering this happened in a backwoods community in the 1930s, where everyone was from predominantly fundamentalist Christian backgrounds, being an unwed mother was bad enough. It was far worse because of who got blamed for it. If you guessed John, you would be right. That's right, folks. My ancestor was accused of getting his half-sister pregnant. I know some of you might want to make a deliverance joke here, but you might want to hold on to that thought. John was completely innocent in the whole matter. Even at a time when mountain folks married young, he was more concerned about surviving under his father's roof long enough to make it to adulthood. The very idea of romance, or anything beyond it, hardly lingered in his mind when self-preservation against constant physical and mental abuse was his daily existence. Not to mention the person he had supposedly gotten pregnant shared a mother with him. He was also only barely 13 years old. This is only the start of the truly horrible part of this story. Because the real person who got that girl pregnant, it wasn't John, but the truth was very close to home. So close, in fact, that he was also in the home. You see, John's parents were both widowed young. Back then, most poor young single parents remarried quickly after losing a spouse, so as to have help caring for the children and running a farm or other business. Both John's father and mother brought children from previous marriages to the arrangement. The problem is that, even though people in those isolated mountain communities were able to withstand the harsher climate, terrain, and livelihoods, there was always a certain degree of innocence among them. John's mother had no idea this charming and charismatic preacher who had just moved into their town after his wife died was really a walking farce of righteousness. She was willing to turn a blind eye to his temper because she thought he was sent as an answer from God to this poor widowed mother. If she had known what sort of monster he was, if anyone knew the red flags he was giving off, maybe she would have reconsidered. Because while John was beaten and his spirit constantly trampled on, that is nothing compared to what his half-sister must have endured. John snapped. After a hellish fight between him and his father, he took his half-sister and fled to her older sister's farm, where she and her new husband made sure they were safe from that demon of the pulpit. While his pregnant sibling would be well cared for there, John couldn't stay there anymore. His father had been revealed to be an irredeemable monster, and his mother, already a woman of weak constitution, had been so broken in spirit enough that all she could do was not interfere in her children's escape. Divorce wasn't heard of back then, so she couldn't have left her husband even if she had wanted. Instead, his eldest half-sister arranged for John to go north to be with his half-siblings on his father's side. They too had borne the brunt of his beatings, so they had been estranged from their father for several years by then. Upon hearing the terrible truth, one of John's half-brothers immediately hopped onto a train and headed down to take the boy home. Can you imagine being John then? This child. For despite how fast children had to grow up back then, he was still very much a child. Having gone to this fortune teller with hope in his heart, only to have his dreams crushed after she told him he had no future. Then finding out the same day that his father had not only molested his sister, but had destroyed her reputation in the community by getting her pregnant. Oh, how I wish that this was the end of the story, folks. But it wasn't. The day he boarded the train, my great-grandfather and a few of John's cousins who knew about the situation went to see him off. They were fairly close, with my great-grandfather being a bit like an older brother to John. As they said their goodbyes, John told them the last words he would ever utter before leaving the mountains for good. That blankety-blank bastard had better not try to make everyone think it was me. Unfortunately, John seemed to have a bit of fortune-teller in him, too, because that is exactly what happened. In an attempt to push the blame away from himself, John's father tried to detract from the whispers of what he did by blaming it on his own son. Thankfully, very few members of his congregation fell for it. Most of them might have turned a blind eye to the harsh mistreatment they had heard John's father like to inflict. But there are some crimes that cross the line. Still, there were enough fools back there that didn't care, that were fooled into believing an innocent boy was responsible for a heinous crime. When the child was finally born, without the fair hair and pale skin of John, but the deep brown flesh and dark hair of John's father, those same people still wrote off the truth. In their twisted minds, they probably thought that, so long as John's father prayed for forgiveness for what he did, it didn't matter how many lives he destroyed in the process. And John's life up north, well, he had to deal with the repercussions of his trauma up until World War II, and even then was just barely in a mental state that he was able to join the military. However, it didn't stop him. Instead, the army actually seemed to do him good. Likely it was because he was able to channel his broken-hearted rage into his training. Finally, he was sent to the Pacific Theater, ending up serving during, I believe, the end of the New Guinea campaign. This last bit was relayed by one of the surviving members of his unit, who managed to track down John's half-brother sometime after the war had ended to tell him the story. While John's unit had been making their way through this snaky jungle terrain, they were set upon by enemy soldiers. The oncoming fire gave them barely enough time to take cover behind some rocks, but the stone barrier wasn't going to provide them protection for long. The opposing troops headed down the hill, ducking behind plentiful trees to keep themselves out of the way of return fire. The man who told the story had become fairly close to John during their time in the army, at least as close as John would let people come. He didn't know the whole story, but he knew that John had a lot of rage and grief built up inside of him. So though John's next actions were incredibly heroic, it was likely he was also suicidal. Maybe it was his way of atoning for what he felt was his being unable to protect his siblings or himself from his monstrous father. Maybe he wanted his trauma to finally end. Maybe he wasn't thinking at all, and just acted on instinct to save his friends. Or maybe, just maybe, he remembered the tea reader's words that he had no future, and wanted to go out a hero. Roaring with the strength of a man who had finally prevailed over his inner demons, John climbed over the rocks and drew his rifle. He began raining cover fire, allowing his fellow soldiers to dart out of the line of fire and head safely to the rendezvous point. The veteran who tracked down John's siblings said he could hear the rapport of rifles and the war cries of both his friend and the enemies until his unit was well off into the distance. John was the only one who would never see his family again. After his passing, John's two half-sisters back in the mountains were given what money he made as a soldier. Before he had died, John made sure that his parents would never see a penny of it. Instead, he helped one of the girls and her husband to expand their farm, and made sure the other one and her child were provided for until she met her own loving husband a year later. I wish I could say that someone shot his father in the back, or took him out into the woods so the bears could eat him. But that didn't happen. That sorry wretch of a man wound up living until he was well on his way to becoming a centenarian, and wound up dying peacefully in his sleep. Because mountain folks have that rule about not talking about certain things with outsiders, no police were ever called in, and John's father's crimes went unpunished. At least, during his lifetime. I'd like to think he went to bed chilly one night and woke up a whole lot hotter, if you get my drift. If only John's paternal grandma had had her tea leaves read. Because the only thing worse than knowing your grandson would have no future is having a son whose fate was to only destroy lives. Yeah, story's finally over, folks. I know this was a long one, so I appreciate those who have stuck with me until the end of it. I wish stories like this were pure works of fiction, but the world isn't like that. I know some of you listening might be going through similar horrors like John and his sisters faced, or might be helping someone that has. Not every story has a happy ending, but not everyone belongs to that old mountain folk belief of, you don't talk about things with outsiders. I know that plenty of people elsewhere like to hide their skeletons in the family closet like this. But never let your pain be shut away like that. Speak up. Go to the cops. Get help. Every single one of you deserves the happy ending that my ancestor never got. The most I can do is to be entirely un-Appalachian and tell this story. Nobody can undo the past. But I like to think that even if John's father could keep a part of the church convinced he was sinless, and anyone who listens to this will know the truth. It's sort of ironic that I'll have people in places like Australia and Egypt that'll believe an old tale of vindication when people in this guy's own community wouldn't. Especially considering, if I remember correctly, the star of this story would have hit the big 100 in a few years, had he lived. Life's weird like that. Anyway, This actually isn't the only story I have revolving around John, but the next one will have to wait a while. It's very long, and as cathartic as it is airing out my family's dirty laundry, I need to work on something more upbeat before I get to that one. And if the story helps someone in the meantime, then I'm doubly glad I shared it. Thank you all so much again. If you could do me a quick favor and hit the like and subscribe buttons as well as the notification bell, your dear old Phantasmal Poppy would be really grateful. And go back and hear the Shiner's Ghost or one of the other funny stories. I'm gonna have to go catch some real cute cat videos myself. Take care, my friends. And see you all real soon.